Well, the task force will now come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the task force at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee not on the task force are authorized to participate in today's hearing. As a reminder, I ask all members to keep themselves muted when they're not being recognized. The staff have been instructed not to mute members except when a member is not being recognized and there is inadvertent background noise. Members are also reminded that they may participate in only one remote proceeding at a time. So if you're participating today, please keep your camera on. And if you choose to attend a different remote proceeding, please turn your camera off. This hearing is entitled, I Am Who I Say I Am, Verifying Identity While Preserving Privacy in the Digital Age. And I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Today, we are here to explore how we can leverage the power of artificial intelligence to create a secure digital identity, and how we can leverage those capabilities with digital infrastructure such as mobile ID to make internet access safer, more available, and equitable for all of us. Digital identification is a long overdue and necessary tool for the United States economy to transition into the digital age, while preventing fraud, ensuring privacy, and improving equity. Especially since COVID, we find ourselves increasingly working, transacting, and interacting online. Hand in hand with that, identity theft is at an all-time high with over 1.3 million reports to the FTC in 2020. A digital identity would provide Americans with a way to prove who they are online in a more secure manner. And people could use it to sign up for government benefits, make a withdrawal from their bank, or to view their medical records, all with the risk of identity theft or fraud approaching zero. Reducing identity fraud would not only provide tremendous savings to individuals and consumers, but would also create massive savings for our government as well. However, it's important to get this right. We must ensure that a digital identity framework is established with an utmost emphasis on privacy and security. And that's why I've introduced the Improving Digital Identity Act of 2020, a bipartisan measure to establish a government-wide approach to improving digital identity. This bill would establish a task force in the Executive Office of the President to develop secure methods for federal, state, and local agencies to validate identity attributes to protect the privacy and security of individuals and support reliable, interoperable digital identity verification in the public and private sectors. This is the first step to determine what our government needs in order to implement this crucial technology. Using the power of AI, we can detect suspicious activity, catch bad actors, and greatly improve our online validation and authentication process. So I thank all of our members and witnesses for being here today. I look forward to this discussion to find out how we can best use artificial intelligence and digital identity to improve the lives of everyday Americans. And the chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
First off, thank you, Chairman Foster, for your leadership on this task force and convening today's hearing and witnesses. I want to commend all of your hard work on this issue and being a thought leader in Congress on how to better protect the personally identifiable information of Americans across the country. I've enjoyed our dialogues on that and look forward to continuing them. Today's hearing provides an opportunity to hear directly from industry experts and stakeholders on advancements in improving the protection of Americans' personal identity. The task force held a similar hearing in 2019, and it is important that we continue to consider gaps that persist and the proper role for the federal government going forward. As a consumer, it often feels like you need to share every important detail of your personal identity in order to even think about creating an account with a financial institution or other internet service provider. Sharing your driver's license, social security number, sometimes your passport, and other sensitive information online can be intimidating and can make consumers question whether their information is safe and secure. And it's not hard to see why. Financial services firms fall victim to cybersecurity attacks approximately 300 times more frequently than other businesses. These breaches have occurred as bad actors have become even more sophisticated and have amassed troves of data on American citizens. This, along with the wealth of data that Americans share daily via social media, has empowered criminals to take advantage of the current identity system, which they then use to commit theft and fraud. To the credit of private industry, we have seen tremendous advances in technology to help secure Americans' private information and identity. The use of AI, machine learning, and blockchain technology has allowed for new forms of analysis that can verify an individual's identity in a secure way. Now it is time for Congress to work with federal regulators to ensure that the United States is equipped with the tools necessary to keep pace internationally. We should consider innovative proposals, such as Mr. Foster's Improving Digital Identity Act, which will establish a task force within the federal government to engage with relevant stakeholders. It will also require Nist to develop a framework of standards for the federal government to follow when providing services to support digital identity verification. I commend him and my other colleagues for their work on this thoughtful legislation. Beyond the obvious concerns regarding fraud and identity theft, I'm also looking forward to learning more today about how other forms of identification verification can increase access to financial services and inclusion. This committee should champion new technologies and their ability to break down barriers that prevent low-income Americans from accessing critical banking services. Digital identity technologies provide a lot of promise and opportunity to further inclusion in our financial services space. I look forward to the discussion today, and I yield back.
Thank you. And today we welcome the testimony of our distinguished witnesses. First, we have Mr. Jeremy Grant, coordinator of the Better Identity Coalition. And next, we will have Mr. David Kelts, director of product development for Get Group North America. Next, we have Dr. Louise Maynard-Atem, research lead, Women in Identity. Next, we have Professor Elizabeth Renieris, founding director of the Notre-Dame-IBM Technology Ethics Lab at University of Notre Dame. And last, we have Mr. Victor Fredung, the Chief Executive Officer of Shufti Pro. Witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer on your screen that will indicate how much time you have left, and a chime will go off at the end of your time. I would ask that you be mindful of the timer and quickly wrap up your testimony when you hear the chime so that we can be respectful both of the witnesses' time and the members' time. Without objection, your written testimony will be made part of the record. And I would just want to also take this moment to really compliment you on the very high quality of your written testimony. It was, it's worth reading more than once because of the deep and important observations that it makes about where digital identity is and should be going in our country. Mr. Grant, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Gonzalez, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm here on behalf of the Better Identity Coalition, an organization focused on bringing together leading firms from different sectors to work with policymakers to improve the way Americans establish, protect, and verify their identities when they're online. Our members include recognized leaders from financial services, health, technology, fintech, payments, and security. Yesterday marked the 3-year anniversary of the release of our Identity Policy Blueprint, which outlined a set of key initiatives that government should launch to improve identity that are both meaningful in impact and practical to implement. Our 24 members are united by a common recognition that the way we handle identity today in the U.S. is broken, and by a common desire to see both the public and private sectors each take steps to make identity systems work better. On that note, I'm very grateful to the AI Task Force for calling this hearing today, as well as to Chairman Foster for his leadership on this topic. The legislation that he and Congressman Katko, Langevin, and Loudermilk introduced 2 weeks ago, the Improving Digital Identity Act of 2021, is the single best way for government to begin to address the inadequacies of America's identity infrastructure. Now, infrastructure, at a high level, I think that should be one of the top takeaways for members of this task force today, that identity is critical infrastructure and needs to be treated as such. DHS said as much in 2019 when it declared identity as one of 55 national critical functions defined as those services so vital to the U.S. that their disruption, corruption, or dysfunction would have a debilitating effect on security. But compared to other critical functions, identity's gotten scant investment and attention, and the Improving Digital Identity Act, if approved, will get us started. And I think we're overdue to get started. The enormity of the problem has been magnified several times over the last 18 months amidst a pandemic that literally made it impossible to engage in most in-person transactions. The pandemic laid bare the inadequacies of our digital identity infrastructure, enabling cybercriminals to steal billions of dollars and creating major barriers for Americans trying to obtain critical benefits and services. More than $63 billion was stolen from state unemployment insurance programs by cybercriminals exploiting weak ID verification systems, according to the Labor Department. On the flip side, we've seen hundreds of stories of Americans who have been unable to get the benefits they desperately need because their applications for unemployment have been falsely flagged for fraud when they find themselves unable to successfully navigate the convoluted and complicated processes many states have put in place to verify identity. Beyond unemployment, the inadequacy of our identity infrastructure remains a major challenge in financial services. FinCEN last year reported banks are losing more than $1 billion each month due to identity-related cybercrime. Meanwhile, millions of Americans can't get a bank account because they don't have the foundational identity documents needed to prove who they are. And amidst all of this, ID theft losses soared by 42% last year. So why are there so many problems here? Well, attackers have caught up with a lot of the first-generation tools we've used to protect and verify and authenticate identity. And while this last year might have driven this point home, the reality is that these tools have been vulnerable for quite some time. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, but the most important question is, what should government and industry do about it now? Now, if there's one message that committees should take away from today's hearing, it's that industry said they can't solve this alone. We're at a juncture where the government will need to step up and play a bigger role to help address critical vulnerabilities in our digital identity fabric. And passing the Improving Digital Identity Act is where we should start. Why is government action needed here? Well, as one of our members noted, the title of this hearing, I Am Who I Say I Am, is technically incorrect, since for all purposes, when it comes to identity, you are who the government says you are. At the end of the day, government is the only authoritative issuer of identity in the US. But identity systems that the government administers are largely stuck in the paper world, whereas commerce has increasingly moved online. This idea of an identity gap, a complete absence of credentials built to support digital transactions, is being actively exploited by adversaries to steal identities, money, and sensitive data, and defraud consumers, governments, and businesses alike. And while industry has come up with some decent tools to try to get around this identity gap, the adversaries have caught up with many of them. Going forward, the government will need to take a more active role in working with industry to deliver next-generation remote ID proofing solutions. Now, this is not about a national ID. We don't recommend one be created. We already have a number of nationally recognized authoritative government identity systems, the driver's license, the passport, the SSN. But because of this identity gap, the systems are stuck in the paper world while commerce is moving online. To fix this, America's paper-based system should be modernized around a privacy-protecting, consumer-centric model that allows consumers to ask an agency that issued a credential to stand behind it in the online world by validating the information from the credential. It's exactly what the Improving Digital Identity Act would do in a way that sets a high bar for privacy, security, and inclusivity. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Note that I have submitted lengthier testimony for the record, including some recommendations on AI and identity. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Grant. And Mr. Kelts, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Gonzalez, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity today. I am David Kelts of Arlington, Massachusetts, representing myself in support of mobile driver's licenses and forming governance for an identity ecosystem that reinforces American values of privacy, equity, and freedom while spurring innovation. I'm the Director of Product Development for GET Group North America, which is piloting the Utah mobile driver's license currently. And I've been a member for over 5 years of the ISO standards working group that wrote the ISO 18013-5 mobile driver's license standard. I lead the evangelism task force for that group, and I was the lead author on the privacy assessment with many international collaborators. An MDL is a digitally signed ID document placed on the mobile phone of the correct individual for them to control. Government issuers around the globe are the signers of the identity information, and this signature allows for using an MDL when government issued ID information is legally required, including for in-person transactions. You don't show your MDL to someone else. Imagine if we were showing credit card numbers to merchants from our phones. Screenshots and editing tools would result in fraud. Instead, you tap or scan and share a token with a verifier or a reader. And that token can be used to request a subset of the MDL data. The MDL holder has full consent over what they share. And with this standard, people can use a mobile driver's license around the country, around the globe. So this minimizing of data to that necessary for the transaction represents an improvement over physical cards, where the full data is always printed on the front and found in the barcode on the back. The ISO 18013-5 MDLs are for trusted data transfer for in-person usage. They're designed, the standard is designed to fit next to other identity standards like OpenID Connect and things like user authentication from the FIDO Alliance. There are challenges to empowering Americans with this mobile ID document in order for us to meet the values and goals of all the people, protecting identity information, giving greater control and flexibility to the rightful holder of the identity, supporting accuracy of these operations. And these come with the goals of improved privacy and inclusivity and access for all. These goals for MDL in person are the same as the goals for identity in cyberspace. MDL itself sort of naturally forms an ecosystem. The government issuers are the signers of the data, so they have a passive role in lending trust to the transaction. This is in the form of a public key used to validate the accuracy, integrity, and provenance of the data. The technology works today and is functional, but government issuers must take the first move. This sets challenges in funding a digital transformation that benefits the residents and businesses within any state. Doing the civic good is not always enough rationale. Consumer pays models seem to be taking hold, similar to our ID cards, but they can require legislative approval. And support for this digital transformation at the state level can keep privacy and American values at the forefront and kickstart contactless ID. Market forces alone will not shape an identity ecosystem that meets our values and goals. Price pressure on software towards free has been driven by these privacy invasive data gathering and advertising models. If the software is free, then you're the product. And kickstarting market forces, if they don't happen, it's possible that entities with very deep pockets can swoop in, meet the market needs, and own an identity ecosystem. So challenges exist on the business side as well, on the verifier side. Businesses and government agencies will wait for a large number of MDL holders before investing and accepting these digital ID documents. That can leave people with no place to use their digital ID. Across the globe, there are government-led trust frameworks like Australia, privately led frameworks like Sovereign, and public-private partnerships such as Pan-Canadian Trust Framework in Canada from DIAC. I recommend initiating a public-private partnership to define a framework that meets our values and goals from the existing pieces and that can enforce those requirements. This can kickstart identity solutions of many types to meet our goals in a digital transformation. Federal agencies can continue to lead and lend their expertise to this and can be incentivized to accept mobile driver's licenses for things like TSA agents to protect their health. DHS innovation programs can be refocused from architectural goals to deployment of contactless ID technology. And we welcome the continued and expanded participation of the federal government and federal agencies. Thank you.
You are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Gonzalez, and the other members of the task force for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Louise Maynard-Atem. I'm the research lead for the nonprofit organization Women in Identity. We're an organization whose mission is to ensure that digital identity solutions are designed and built with the diverse communities that they are intended to serve in mind. We're a volunteer-led organization, and we all work full-time in the digital identity sector. We're entirely independent and not acting in the interests of any one organization or individual, but we are all united by the belief that we need identity systems that work for everyone by ensuring that they are inclusive and free from bias, and that's the specific topic I would like to talk about today. So the need for improved digital identity systems and infrastructure has been a pressing requirement for many years as more businesses have moved their operations online. The pandemic has accelerated that transition, and the need has become more critical in the last 18 months. The shift presents us with a unique opportunity to enable economic and societal value creation as digital identity systems become the gatekeeper to services like online banking and in e-commerce and insurance. However, we also need to recognize that the use of technology in these systems has the potential to further entrench and potentially exacerbate the exclusionary and biased practices that persist in society today. Simply digitizing what were previously analog processes and utilizing flawed data would be a missed opportunity to deliver systems and services that benefit all citizens. At Women in Identity, we believe that inclusion doesn't just happen on its own. For identity systems to be inclusive and free from bias, the requirement must be explicitly mandated. There's countless examples of where exclusion and bias haven't been explicitly mandated against, and in many of those instances, systems have been built that exclude certain groups, often based on characteristics like race, gender, culture, socioeconomic background, or disability. According to recent population stats in the United States, approximately 11% of adults don't have government-issued ID documents, approximately 18% of adults don't use a smartphone, and 5.4% of US households are unbanked. Now, government-issued IDs, ownership of smartphones, having a bank account can often be the building blocks used for creating digital identity services for an individual. Now, it's essential that any solution that we develop has to be accessible for all of the groups that I've mentioned and doesn't cause them to be further excluded from opportunities that such technology might present. If we think about the physical world, we would never erect buildings that weren't accessible to all. Features like wheelchair ramps are mandated. We need to make sure that we're mandating the equivalent accessibility in the digital world. Within Women in Identity, we've seen a move towards identity trust frameworks being developed, where the need for inclusion and testing for bias is being explicitly called out. Here in the UK, I wanted to mention the UK Digital Identity and Attribute Trust Framework that Women in Identity was involved in consulting on. This framework sets out the requirements to help organizations understand what a good identity verification looks like. There are explicit callouts that make sure products and services are inclusive and accessible, and organizations are required to complete an annual exclusion report to transparently explain if certain users or user groups are excluded and why. The Information Commissioner in the UK has responded in support of the trust framework, but raises caution if digital identities and attribute systems are relying on automated processing due to the use of algorithms or artificial intelligence within those systems. Automated decision-making may have discriminatory effects due to bias present in the system design, the algorithms used, or the data sets used in the creation of the product or service. At Women in Identity, we're currently carrying out a piece of research that seeks to understand the societal and economic impact of exclusion in the context of digital identity and specifically within financial services. We hope that this research will inform a creation of a code of conduct designed to help solution providers identify and mitigate potential areas of bias and exclusion in product design, to ensure that the industry is building products that work for everybody, not just the select few. So to conclude, we believe that in order to achieve the full potential of digital identity systems, inclusion requirements must be specifically and explicitly mandated for within any regulation or legislation, and also that they must be measured on an ongoing basis. There are a number of examples within the written testimony where I describe how this is being done elsewhere, and I strongly believe that in the benefit of sharing best practices and lessons learned with other industry bodies and consumer advocacy groups to ensure that we're delivering systems that enable all citizens equally. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Ms. Maynard-Atem. Professor Renieris, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Gonzalez, and members of this task force for the opportunity to testify before you. My name is Elizabeth Renieris. I'm a professor of the practice and founding director of the Notre-Dame-IBM Technology Ethics Lab at the University of Notre Dame, a technology and human rights fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, and a fellow at Stanford's Digital Civil Society Lab. My research is focused on cross-border data governance frameworks and the ethical and human rights implications of digital identity systems, artificial intelligence, and blockchain and distributed ledger technologies. I am testifying in my personal capacity, and my views do not necessarily reflect those of any organizations with which I'm affiliated. I began my legal career as an attorney working on cybersecurity policy at the Department of Homeland Security, and went on to practice as a data protection and privacy lawyer on 3 continents. As a consultant, I've had the opportunity to advise the World Bank, UK Parliament, European Commission, and others on data protection, blockchain, AI, and digital identity. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in a hearing on this important topic today. As laid bare by the COVID-19 pandemic, we increasingly depend on digital tools and services for work, school, healthcare, banking, government services, and nearly all aspects of our lives. And unlike when we interact or transact in person, we have limited visibility into who or what is on the other end of a digital interaction or transaction. Even before the pandemic, vulnerabilities in digital identity systems contributed to attacks on our energy supply, hospitals, financial institutions, and other critical infrastructure. As these sectors are digitized, automated, and algorithmically and computationally manipulated, they increasingly depend on secure digital identity. As we evolve into a world with the internet and everything, with all manner of IoT devices, sensors, network technologies, and other connected systems, the digital is becoming the built environment. Without secure, reliable, and trustworthy digital identity for people, entities, and things, this new cyber-physical reality is increasingly vulnerable to attacks threatening individual safety and national security. Digital identity is becoming critical infrastructure. As dominant technology companies pursue new revenue streams in healthcare, education, financial services, and more, privately owned and operated ID systems with profit-maximizing business models may threaten the privacy, security, and other fundamental rights of individuals and communities. Often, they also incorporate new and advanced technologies such as AI, machine learning, blockchain, and advanced biometrics that are not well understood and not subject to sufficiently clear legal or governance frameworks. In order to engender trust, safety, and security in the digital ecosystem, we need trustworthy, safe, and secure digital identity. And in order to engender trust, safety, and security in our society, we need to deploy it ethically and responsibly. Recognizing the growing importance of digital identity as critical infrastructure and seeking to rein in the private control over it, governments in the European Union, Canada, New Zealand, and elsewhere are prioritizing efforts to design and build the infrastructure needed to support robust digital identity. For example, the European Commission is working on a universally accepted public electronic identity, or EID, to access digital products and services, including as an alternative to privacy-invasive solutions such as login with Facebook or Google. Even as we have hundreds of frameworks for ethical AI, we lack any specific to digital identity. To remain competitive globally, avoid enclosure of the public sphere through privatized identity schemes, and protect the civil and human rights of Americans, the federal government must take the lead in shaping the technical, commercial, legal, and ethical standards for the design, development, and deployment of these systems as critical infrastructure. And the Improving Digital Identity Act is a good first step in that direction. Such standards must not only include best practices with respect to the privacy and security of data, but also measures for fairness, transparency, and accountability on the part of entities designing and deploying the technology, strong enforcement and oversight, and adequate remedies and redress for the people impacted. They must also address power asymmetries, the risks of exclusion and discrimination, and the specific challenges associated with the use of blockchain, AI, and other emerging technologies. We must avoid building digital ID systems and infrastructure in a way that would further expand and entrench the surveillance state, as do the national identity systems in India or China. When we move through the physical world today, we are really rarely asked to identify ourselves. But as everything increasingly has a digital component, and as the market for digital ID grows, we are at risk of flipping that paradigm. To avoid the erosion of privacy through persistent and ubiquitous identification, we will also need guardrails around the use of these systems, including when and why identity can be required. If we are not careful, we might go from identity as the exception to identity as the rule. To summarize my recommendations for Congress, we must recognize that digital identity is critical infrastructure. The federal government must lead to create standards for safe, secure, and trustworthy ID. Those standards must address specific challenges associated with new and emerging technologies and ensure a public option. And finally, we need guardrails around the use of ID to avoid ID becoming an enabler of surveillance and control. Thank you again for the opportunity. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor. And your timing was accurate to the second. So my compliments on that as well. Mr. Fredung, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Gonzalez, and distinguished members of the committee. I'm excited to be here and thank you for inviting me to testify before you today on this very important topic. My name is Fredung, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Shufti Pro. Shufti Pro is an identity verification and compliance platform that provides services to government agencies and companies throughout the world. Our services, primarily focusing on identity verification, or what's more commonly referred to as KYC, Know Your Customers, relies on using automated technologies such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, and have successfully been used by companies from all corners of the world to not only verify their customers' ID documents, but also verify their customers truly who they say they are. When it comes to identity verification, most clients utilize our services that combine document verification, facial verification, liveness check, and optical character recognition. Together, they provide an accuracy of above 99% and give businesses the assurance that they are taking the appropriate steps to verify their customers. In addition, we offer what we refer to as a configurable approach to the verification flow. And by configurable, we mean that we allow the clients to build up their own verification services and decide on the settings as to how a particular verification should be performed. This is crucial for businesses to comply with different regulatory bodies since the requirements and configurations look different throughout the world. I think we can all agree on that the timing of this particular subject is entirely in line. During the pandemic, we witnessed the world turning towards digitalization and relying more and more on using the internet for their everyday tasks. The problem, however, was that not all were equally prepared. I would like to discuss a couple of topics with you today, the first involving how AI can help enhance verification of customers. So to give you the background story of ourselves, we started our journey back in 2017 when most businesses relied on using either a hybrid or a manual approach to verifying customers. A hybrid approach includes, for the most part, a physical person taking a look at an ID document and a selfie to verify if it's genuine or not. The problem with this approach is that, first of all, it's not scalable. Secondly, it's also very time-consuming and in the end, usually very costly for the client using the service. So what we did was to begin by using artificial intelligence and machine learning to help detect security features that can be found on different ID documents. For example, microprintings, holograms, or even the placement of the text. We also saw that some customers might try to tamper with portions of the document, perhaps changing their date of birth or their nationality. So we developed our anti-spoofing technology that also combines texture detection, hologram verification, and liveness check to accurately verify that customers who they say they are and that they aren't trying to fake their identity. And by experimenting with the usage of automated technology, we not only saw that verifications could be processed at a much faster pace, we also saw that capturing identity theft increased significantly since sophisticated fraudsters can change security features that would bypass the human eye. The second topic that I would like to discuss today is in regards to data privacy and how end users can feel secure when providing their identity. As we all know, data breaches happen to even some of the world's biggest companies, and it's usually not the business that suffers the most. It's the end users that gets their identity compromised. There is, however, different ways to try and solve this. And as an example, by utilizing on-device verifications where none of the data is transmitted elsewhere. Another example would be that the providers or the clients do not store any sensitive data on behalf of the customers. They simply just receive a confirmation that the customer was successfully verified by the appropriate standards, and after that, all the data is erased. Here is unfortunately usually a problem since most frameworks require the data to be kept for X amount of years. There are also a lot of ongoing discussions and experiments as to how to enable blockchain as part of the data sharing, as well as the storage of the customer's data, and how to allow customers to reuse their already proven identity. This is, however, mostly in prototype stages at the moment, but definitely something to look out for in the future. The last topic I would like to mention is from our research into the many different kinds of identity frameworks and the documents that we come by from across the world. Using the United States as an example, we see different requirements and obligations from different sectors, in addition to each state having its own unique set of ID documents that do not yet follow a universal framework when it comes to the security features on the documents. This usually provides a problem for a lot of companies, not only in the United States, but across all over the world, where requirements, documents, and settings differentiate, and no universal framework is applicable. We strongly applaud the Real ID Act and the minimum security standards it establishes, and would strongly suggest continued pursuit of a universal framework that each state needs to follow when it comes to the selection of ID documents, and a unified requirement when it comes to what information needs to be verified and how verification should be performed in all the states. I also support Chairman Foster's and Congressman Loudermilk's Improving Digital Identity Act and its purpose of modernizing digital ID infrastructure. Thank you for inviting me to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you. And I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Just to get an initial idea of what the scope of improvement that we might be able to see if we have widespread use of high-quality mobile ID. If you look at the large high-profile hacks that have happened, that have hit the headlines, the Colonial Pipeline, the DCCC hack of a few years back, what fraction of these would be largely eliminated if we had widespread use of a mobile ID second-factor authentication instead of just passwords?
I'm happy to jump in if I can. I think most of them, in that I think it's an anomaly these days when a major incident happens and identity is not the attack vector. Though I want to just to differentiate, when we talk about identity, to me, we're talking about two things. There's identity proofing, what you do when you're opening an account, and then there's authentication, how you log in after you've already opened an account. I think a lot of the fraud we've seen in unemployment systems has been taking advantage of the identity proofing challenge. How do you prove that you're really Bill Foster for the first time, and which Bill Foster, given that there's probably several thousand of you? There, we basically saw stolen data used to cut through whatever protections a lot of states had in place, or in some cases they had none at all, to steal billions of dollars. With regard to some of the other breaches that we've seen, Colonial Pipeline, some things with ransomware, there it's much more focused on authentication. How do you compromise a password, or even in some cases compromise some, first generation forms of multi-factor authentication, like ones that are based on a code that's texted to you that's now phishable as well. So I think overall, both identity proofing and authentication, we've got big problems. If we could close both of those gaps, you really start to raise the cost of attacks for a lot of criminals and make it much harder for them to do the things that they've been doing.
Okay. One of the things that I think many of you have mentioned in your testimony was how COVID has sort of changed the profile of identity and the fact that we're moving more and more online. It's becoming more important. The other thing that is that's happened is that there is real bipartisan agreement that we have to get a broadband connection to essentially all Americans, and that there's a real federal role in subsidizing that. I think that at last count, the Republican talking number was $65 billion that should be dedicated to this. The Democrat counteroffer was 100. But as long as it, if we end anywhere in between those two numbers, we're going to have a real step forward for closing the digital divide and getting at least a low-end digital device in the hands of all Americans and a broadband account. And so, given that, how would you then piggyback products, for example, digital driver's license or other ways? How do we get this so that that's the second part of provisioning a broadband and digital identity to people? Anyone who wishes to grab it. Yeah.
So yes, I think that access to broadband, that access to connectivity and phones will help to increase accessibility to everyone. And I would say that to the same level of accessibility as getting an ID card that you currently have, and being able to use that. The technology in MDL, I'll speak specifically about that, is geared to use on really any phone, because there are multiple ways that you can interact with that for in person. And we expect we can cover vast majority of phones that are out there, provided they have either a screen or NFC or something that allows for the transmission. So I think that would be a huge step towards accessibility for everyone of mobile identities.
Yeah, and when we do this, how do we make sure that the equity issues are addressed properly? Let's say we should have the PhD material scientist weigh in on this, who seems to be very interested and involved in this set of issues.
I think as soon as you start to drive access for everybody, then there are lots of different solutions that you can put in place. So if we're establishing a baseline of everyone has access to some kind of device, then I think that really levels the playing field out. It's not saying everybody needs to have a smartphone, it's just everyone needs to have access to something. And I think that's a big hurdle. Certainly in the UK, we're going at it from a vouching standpoint. So if you don't have access, you can say, someone says you're you, and we can take that as standard. But if there's an ability to provide everybody with some kind of technology so that they can use these services, then I think that really moves the accessibility debate really far forward.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, I think, in your testimony, the EID effort in the EU. Is that correct? Oops, I'm out of time here. Okay. Let's see. For members that are interested, if there's time, we're probably going to be able to have time for a second round. And if that fails, we will continue our tradition of, at the end of the formal part of the hearing, I will gavel it closed, and we can just sit around and talk. Sort of the Zoom equivalent of just hanging around in the ante-room and talking with our witnesses, which is often the most valuable part of a hearing. So I will now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and for our great witnesses here today. Before I get started, I ask for unanimous consent to add to the record a letter from the National Association of Convenience Stores, please.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Mr. Grin, I want to start with you, and it's good to see you and look forward to reconnecting down the road. As we were talking yesterday a bit offline, I told you I'm excited to support Mr. Foster's Improving Digital Identity Act. I think it's a step in the right direction for sure. My question is, beyond the Improving Digital Identity Act, what additional areas should this committee be focused on from a legislative standpoint with respect to digital ID?
Oh, thank you for the question, Congressman, and good to see you again. I'd say, starting with the Foster bill, look, it's a great place to start in that it finally starts to pull together what I would call a whole of government approach to looking at this issue. And one of the challenges I think we have in the U.S. is we have nationally recognized authoritative identity systems, but they're split between the federal, state, and local level. I got my birth certificate from the county I was born in. The state DMV gives me my driver's license, and I have a passport from the State Department. And what's great about that bill is it starts to look at how do you take a consistent standards-based approach so that any American could ask any of those entities to vouch for them when they're trying to prove who they are online. And as I think was mentioned in the opening statements, also has Nist set a high bar for security and privacy. I think a big question that's going to come beyond that is going to be how to fund some of that, particularly in the states where I know David Kelts talked a little bit about the work he's doing with mobile driver's licenses. I think there's, a concern that, while there's a handful of states doing things there now, if we are not going to actually invest dollars in trying to jumpstart that activity in the states, that it might be, say, 15 years before we start to get to critical mass of people having some digital corollary to their paper documents. And that's going to be a real issue. And I think the infrastructure bill that's being negotiated, as Chairman Foster pointed out, could be a great place to put some money in to help accelerate that. I think beyond that, the more AI is going to be used, there's probably going to be more questions to be asked. And this task force is obviously going to be a great place to evaluate some of those considerations.
Great. Ms. Renieris, same question for you. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the legislation, but just areas beyond it that we should be considering at the committee level to foster greater adoption of digital ID.
Sure, thank you for the question. I would say firstly on the legislation in particular, I'd just like to point out one red flag that I am concerned about, which is a reliance on consumer consent. So as we've been having conversations around state and federal privacy legislation, I think there's growing awareness around some of the limitations on consent-based frameworks in this context. So in going forward, it might be worth reconsidering the basis for some of the personal data processing involved in these identity systems. Separate and apart from that, really, I think a lot of this is the question of the underlying infrastructure in other sectors. So for example, even if you had a really robust whole of government approach and created, the sufficient privacy and security technical standards through Nist or otherwise, you would still have a problem, for example, if our healthcare infrastructure can't ingest those standards or those technologies. So we really have to think about other upgrades across critical infrastructure and other sectors in order for digital identity to be, woven in and layered on top. And I think the third thing is really something that's already been pointed out around mandating inclusion in the conversation. I think as we've expressed in our testimonies and as we've seen in the field, there can be a real lack of diversity in these conversations. And so in addition to the interagency kind of diversity, I think the diversity of expertise and voices at the table is really critical.
Thank you. And then Mr. Kelt, with the pilot program in Utah, what are the biggest learnings? And I'm looking for sort of barriers, things that have been difficult that this committee should have on our minds as that program has unfolded.
So I think that the demands that we've seen from consumers has been larger than expected, which has been great. We're very early in the pilot program and provisioning people. But that's a key thing. And as well, the demand from business, the ability for the state government to engage businesses along the whole process, right from the beginning of the RFP process, and to engage those stakeholders has been a huge advantage for making this work in Utah.
Great. I see I'm out of time. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And the chair will now recognize the chairwoman of the full committee, Representative Waters, for 5 minutes of questions. Whoops.
Thank you very much. I'm on now. Well, first of all, Mr. Foster, I want to thank you for the attention that you have paid to this identification issue and the work that you're doing that is so important. I would like to ask Dr. Maynard-Atem a question. And if this has been answered already, then I won't proceed with it, and I can talk about it with you later on. It's about the use of artificial intelligence, of course, for individual identification that has raised concerns about algorithms of bias. As you know, smartphone authentication can employ voice or facial recognition technologies, but these technologies have been shown to exhibit bias against women and minorities. In fact, researchers have found that facial recognition technologies falsely identified Black and Asian faces 10 to 100 times more than white ones, and falsely identified women more than they did men. Do you have any concerns that a digital identity system could also exhibit this kind of bias? If so, what steps need to be taken to eliminate this bias?
Absolutely, thank you for that question. I think there is always the risk that if you're starting to introduce emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning, you run the risk of bias creeping in, depending on the way that those systems have been built and the data that those systems have been tested upon. I think a lot of the issues arise from a very homogeneous test data being used to actually test these systems. So when they are learning how to recognize faces, they are tested and trained on a very homogeneous data set. So that might be all male, that might be people, or the majority male, or the majority people of one particular race. And I think the way that we sort of correct for that is by ensuring that the data that we're using to build algorithms, to build these things that detect facial characteristics of men and women and races of all colors, is to make sure that that test data is as diverse as the population that the system is then going on to serve. We need to make sure that we are equally representing all genders, all races in all of that test data, so the algorithms actually learn to recognize everybody equally, rather than situations we've had previously where they have learned specifically to recognize one person or one type of person at the detriment potentially of others.
But what you're describing is precisely what was discovered a long time ago with medicine, and the lack of diversity in the testing that has not led to the ability to deal with some of the problems that we have found in minority communities, Black communities in particular. And so you do think that this is an important part of moving forward with any identification, is absolutely having the kind of diversity in the testing that will bring us to the results that we need. How far well, I don't know if this is a good question or not, but I think we have improved, the testing in medicine, and particularly with certain diseases where, they had to work hard to get minorities in the testing programs. But do you know whether or not it is proven that this has really taken place with medicine, and that the corrections have been made and they've been able to advance the pharmaceutical products based on the testing that was done because they know what's needed in any particular minority group? Do you know anything about that?
I don't know specifically whether it's been proven that it has been done, but I think the key point here is that, like I said in my testimony, these things, inclusion, calling out bias, don't just happen on their own. And I think that they need to be mandated. I think we need to call out specifically in legislation that you have to test for these things. You have to test for bias, and you have to make sure that people are included, and you have to test on an ongoing basis. This can't just be something that you do once and then put it on the shelf and never address again. You have to test. In the UK, it's proposed that it's being done on an annual basis for digital identity systems. We need to be testing and retesting to ensure that any bias that does exist in systems is called out, is explained, and then action plans are put in place to make sure that that exclusionary technique or system doesn't then persist going forwards.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that information, and I will follow up with my colleague, Mr. Foster, and you as we move forward with this whole issue. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. And the chair will now recognize our colleague from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair, and I also want to thank the witnesses for being here today. It's very insightful. Mr. Fredung, I want to direct the questions to you this morning in the brief time that we have. So with the continued growth and the expanding use of cryptocurrencies, we've seen an increased rollout by exchanges becoming compliant with anti-money laundering. So how are these Know Your Customer programs performing compared to traditional finance counterparts?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Congressman, for that question. And as we all know, cryptocurrency is getting more and more use in the world, not only for investment opportunity, but also for everyday tasks. When it comes to the legislation and capturing the criminals as well, we do see it happening a few different changes here and there as well. Unfortunately, the problem we see in the space at the moment is that there's not really too many legislations when it comes to cryptocurrency exchanges. As an example, here in Europe, we have the Estonian licensing part as an example. We also have it in the United Kingdom, which have just started issuing different licenses for a few selected clients. This is a problem that we see in the space, that there needs to be an easier way for different businesses that operate the cryptocurrency exchange to become licensed, in essentially offering customers to buy cryptocurrency from them. I would like to bring up here as well that I do believe Shane Analysis company spoke in one of the previous hearings as well, where they also discussed in regards to the bad actors of using cryptocurrency. And I think that he also mentioned there was a number of around 0.4%, which is even a decrease from previous years as well. But yeah, as the world is becoming more adapted towards cryptocurrency, I believe so will also the technology providers that are facilitating the identification and verification of customers. And there are plenty of good tools available to help preventively against illegal crypto transactions alongside a strict onboarding process. So I would say most businesses pretty much have a good defense at the moment with the available tools in space.
Very good. Thank you for that. So as technology continues to advance and we look for new ways to identify consumers without jeopardizing their data, so that's key. How can we utilize the blockchain as a tool for digital identity verification? And that'll be also for you.
Sorry. Yeah, I accidentally clicked my mute button there as well.
Yeah.
So using the blockchain for the KYC purposes is very interesting. And as mentioned, definitely something to look out for in the future. And by enabling the usage of blockchain, it could help solve a lot of the issues which are key space at the moment, such as unauthorized access to customer data, or a secure way of transmitting user data, as well as having a better user experience as well. Because I think we can all understand that for a customer to essentially go for a verification process over and over again, it's not really a user seamless experience. In addition to the data privacy here as well, so there are other parts instead of using blockchain as well. So that could also be essentially using on-device verification where none of the data is transmitted elsewhere as well.
So financial institutions are subject to a patchwork of state-based data security and breach notification laws here in the US, so by state. So in addition to federal regulations that we saw in the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act years ago, so also there's no federal standard for data security for non-financial institutions that handle consumer data. What regulatory improvements would you suggest? And that's also for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. So when it comes to improvements in the regulatory frameworks, there are a few different suggestions that I'd like to bring forward. So the first one being a universal framework where the requirements and security standards are aligned. The second one would be an update to the existing ID documents issued by the states by modernizing the security features located on the documents, making it harder for fraudsters to try and tamper with their information. Maybe in addition, also requiring a liveness check to be performed. This is something that we do see is not a requirement in all the different frameworks that we come across. This is essentially a great tool to defend oneself against the easier fraudulent attempts. Apart from that, we do conduct heavily research in regards to these matters, and we will be delighted to share it with officers requesting this after the call as well.
Really appreciate that. That's all the questions I have. I appreciate your generosity, your time, and for the whole panel. So I'll yield back to the chair.
Thank you. And the chair will now recognize my colleague from Illinois, Mr. Caston, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. And I really want to thank you for doing this hearing. You've been leading on this for a long time, Mr. Foster, and we wouldn't be doing this but for your leadership. And my goodness, it's obvious we need to. So thank you. I want to direct my questions to Ms. Renieris. The first is over the last couple of years, there's been talk of, I think both Google and Apple have talked about introducing a digital driver's license, a digitization of your driver's license on their mobile apps. Do you have any ethical concerns with essentially a private digital ID supplanting a government-managed digital ID?
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman. So this is an issue I alluded to in my testimony, and I go into more depth in my written testimony. So what Apple and Google have basically done is created the digital wallet infrastructure to post a digitized version of your government-issued driver's license or your analog, physical ID at this point. It's quite telling that that what they've created is not necessarily a digitally native ID, but rather a digital version of those artifacts that we're all used to. And I think that's an important distinction. It is true that they have very sophisticated capabilities now embedded into smartphones, including improved secure enclaves and other technologies, localized machine learning and data processing that improve some of the data security and privacy aspects of the mobile digital wallet and credentials stored therein. But there are serious ethical and also privacy concerns that I have going beyond the data itself. Specifically, I have concerns around incentives and business models. So what we've seen over and over again is that a lot of the business models and the sort of commercial incentives around the products and services provided by some of the companies you mentioned, including Apple and Google, are not necessarily business models that support civic interests and the values that we're really concerned about, and they actually very often cut against those. So, for example, with the Apple ID, we don't yet know exactly what the business model is. However, it's basically the same technology as Apple Pay, which we know has transaction fees associated with it for different players in the ecosystem. So you can start to see how, depending on the business model and the commercial incentives, this could create sort of perverse incentives for the use of ID, perhaps in contexts where it's not necessary or it didn't exist before. There are also concerns about the ease of use, right? So the easier, the sleeker these credentials are, it feels like not a big deal. And we start to normalize things like biometrics. We start to normalize presenting our ID in contexts where perhaps it shouldn't be, appropriate or required. So I think there are concerns that go beyond the data. And when we just think about the security and privacy of data, we lose sight of the security and privacy of people. And those are two very different things. And the technologists designing and building these systems have a very narrow definition of privacy, which is really a technical mathematical view of it. So we have to sort of resituate identity in the context of this socio-technical system that it is, in the context of culture and law and economics and all of these other things, to think about what the true impact will be on people rather than looking at a specific tool or a specific technology.
So thank you for that. This is a question that obviously gets beyond digital ID and of course spans every committee in Congress, but because we're in the Financial Services Committee, we spend a lot of time and we have crafted a lot of regulations around what happens if I give my money to someone who is a custodian of that money, and we have developed fiduciary rules of looking out for the best interests of that money. And arguably our data is a link to our money and a lot more, as you point out. There have been some people who have talked about, should we create a fiduciary rule to apply to people who hold our data? And I'm curious if you've heard any of that, if you've heard any of those proposals, if you're familiar with them, and if you have any thoughts on that as a possible way through some of this morass. Should the private sector get ahead of us? Because once people turn the data over, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, I don't think. So your thoughts on a fiduciary rule for data?
I think that certain fiduciary duties of confidentiality and loyalty and others associated with entities for processing and storing data can make sense. I think it's sort of a small piece of a much more comprehensive approach that we need. Obviously, an approach that at the moment is very disjointed across state and federal proposals. So I do think that we need to think about what's the underlying legal infrastructure that we have in terms of privacy and data security and data protection. But again, those are just sort of one piece of a more comprehensive framework that we need. We may also need to think about identity-specific data-related governance frameworks. For example, the combination of data privacy and digital identity infrastructure, and pointing out kind of areas of where those frameworks overlap and where they diverge and how to reconcile them. But I agree it's a big piece of this.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you. And we will now recognize our colleague from Texas, Mr. Taylor, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this hearing. I think this is an important topic. And wanted to give Mr. Grant, just talking to you, you mentioned in your written testimony theft from the unemployment programs. I've talked to some of my colleagues who are pretty mortified by the billions and billions that was stolen because of unfortunate, loopholes in the administration of those programs. And I realize that digital ID is a component of fighting against that fraud. How do you see AI working with existing frameworks being a way to combat fraud in unemployment insurance?
Well, I think it's the way I'd look at it. There's, both how would I say it? When I look at, solving identity is, one part of broader fraud reduction and handling risk there. And I think, solving this issue, presents an issue. It presents, a couple different dimensions where, even outside of the things that you might be doing on identity for verification, you might have AI, running in broader fraud prevention systems to be looking at some different signals. Now, I'll say my take is probably 2/3 to 3/4 of those are going to be identity related in terms of, are you able to see, say, sniff out how somebody's potentially using stolen data, or see something about the device they're logging in on that is exhibiting signs that might be a bot entering the data rather than an individual. I think a lot of it's going to come to identity at the end of the day, but there's certainly, I think, broader places we're seeing a lot of these same companies in the space look at things that touch other elements beyond individual identity.
Yeah, and just to my colleagues, I'll be trying to work on getting AI language into some of the appropriations to try and prevent fraud. I think that is something that we should begin to look at and start to think about. And obviously, being the AI task force, it is germane topically to what we do. Shifting over, Professor Renieris, just to ask you a question about identity technology gone wrong. And I mean, obviously, I think it was really important. I think what Chairman Foster said at the beginning of this, that we want to have an identity system which is consistent with our values as Americans of protecting identity and protecting information. And I kind of think about China and how they were able, the Chinese Communist Party, in their control of digital payments, is able to control people's movements and able to stop people who are not, in favor with the Chinese Communist Party from being able to buy a plane ticket. And if they're really not in favor, not even buy a train ticket or even ride a bus. And so thinking about the technology being, in my mind, abused to really suppress people in a way that is Orwellian. Can you give us examples of other ways that identity technology has gone wrong, not necessarily in this country, but in other countries?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Congressman. There are many examples. So I think one of the most important things to point out is that in a lot of other countries, the digital identity systems are basically mandated national ID schemes that are tied to civil registration and vital statistics. So if you can't obtain a digital identity in those countries, you are effectively locked out of life. There is basically nothing you can do and you don't exist. And so I think that's that's the broad level risk. The second layer of that is that in a lot of countries, what we've seen with digital ID schemes gone wrong, they've tried to integrate, they've basically used a single identifier. So for example, the Aadhaar number in India, and that single identifier is able to track your activity across all facets of your life, from employment to healthcare to school to pretty much everything you do. And so that's another area where you can't retain sort of autonomy over specific domains of your life. And for example, you can't be, you can't separate your personal and professional reputation, and you can't have this kind of contextualized personal identity. And so I think that's also really problematic. It's also problematic from the standpoint of data security, right? And so if you compromise your number, you have concerns around that. I think going back to the point around inclusion, a lot of these systems were designed without thinking outside of the technology. So for example, there are countries where women are disproportionately less connected and don't have access to things like mobile devices. And so in those countries where digital identity is now through a mobile device, they're basically at the mercy of, a partner or someone else to exist and to operate in that country. Again, a reason to look beyond the sort of privacy and security of data and the specific parameters of a technology and think about how they operate in an actual context. I go into more detail in my written testimony.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And we will now recognize our colleague from North Carolina, Ms. Adams, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair Foster, Ranking Member Gonzalez, and also to our chairwoman for holding this hearing. And to the witnesses, thank you for your testimony as well. Bias in AI algorithms is a common and widespread concern as the technology has become more entrenched in our daily lives. And as I recall distinctly, a few years back when facial recognition software falsely identified my late Congressional Black Caucus colleague, John Lewis, as a criminal. This very real problem that biased AI is having real world impact does deserve our scrutiny. So I'm glad that we're having these discussions. And that's why I fought successfully to include report language in our annual appropriations packages that ask the National Science Foundation to partner with NGOs and academic institutions to study algorithmic bias more intently. Professor Renieris, in your testimony, you noted that mistakes in AI ID verification can have significant consequences. So how can we stop the digital identity process from becoming over-reliant on potentially flawed AI algorithms? And what role should the federal government and state governments play in the distribution of digital identities?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I think this is one of the most important questions and most important conversations to have around digital identity. So going back to Dr. Atem's comments around the quality of data, I think, of course, that is a really important consideration. And I actually do think that we're making progress there. And parties who are designing these systems are more cognizant of the need for the data sets to reflect, the populations that these systems will operate in. However, I think what we're not looking at as closely is who's designing and building these technologies in the first place. So regardless of how good the underlying data is, risks are not going to be identified by people if we only have homogenous teams building these things, because they can only perceive the risk that they've been exposed to or that they understand. And so the reason you need a really diverse set of people building these things is to spot these risks in advance and to be able to flag them and to mitigate them, build them into the design of the technology. So there are certainly concerns around bias in the algorithms, but there are concerns in all the different components of this that flow throughout. Earlier, we talked about different kinds of biometrics like face and voice, which we know are subject to both gender and racial bias. But increasingly, the future is looking into things like behavioral biometrics, which are essentially profiling technologies, right? And so those are also going to raise concerns about equity, discrimination, privacy, and inclusion. So I think, again, to make this sustainable and sort of forward-looking, the bad actors are always going to be able to outsmart the sort of state of the art of the technology. And so the only way to get ahead of this is to think about how these technologies operate broadly in these socio-technical systems. But you're absolutely right that is a primary concern in this space. Thank you so much.
Mr. Grant, despite some of the problems we've discussed today, there are undoubtedly benefits to employing AI to protect consumers. So with the increase in data breaches, particularly at credit reporting agencies where large amounts of personally identifiable information has been exposed, how can AI help with distinguishing between legitimate and illegitimate histories of activity to detect or prevent digital identity fraud?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I just, before I answer that, would love to piggyback on what Elizabeth had said, in that I think as we're concerned about bias, and I think this plays into your question as well here, so much of what we're dealing with AI are predictive systems that are essentially trying to use AI and machine learning to guess what, at the end of the day, only the government really knows. And I believe, and I talked about this in my written testimony, I think one of the best things the government can do would be to advance the bill Congressman Foster recently introduced, in that it brings in that deterministic layer, what's actually in authoritative government identity systems, to complement the probabilistic layer. And I think that's going to be one way to address concerns about bias. In terms of how AI is being used, more constructively, particularly when we've just got, terabytes of stolen identity data that's now being used to commit identity fraud. I think one thing we're seeing is a lot of vendors out there, when they can actually identify, say, what an organized crime ring is doing, AI can study how they enter data and then be able to analyze that and learn, whether it's, what it looks like somebody's doing when they're interacting with the device, how they are holding it. Some of these things do tap into behavioral, but if you can start to learn what looks like it might be malicious behavior, you can then start to generate alerts that might, kick some of those applications in a way that if it doesn't block it, at least kicks it off to a secondary layer of examination where you can make a more informed decision.
Thank you, sir. I'm out of time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And we will now recognize our colleague from Massachusetts, Mr. Auchincloss, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Foster, thank you for putting this together. And I want to echo your comments at the beginning of this session, complimenting our witnesses for the excellence of their written testimony. I thought it was superb. Certainly learned a lot, so I appreciate that. Mr. Grant, in your written testimony and in your oral testimony, you talk about the Improving Digital Identity Act, and one element of that would be asking the National Institute of Standards and Technology to really take the lead on setting the protocols and the standards for what identity proofing, which, as you've said, is sort of the harder part increasingly, would look like. I want to dig into that a little bit with you. Could you tell us maybe the 3 W's of that, who should be involved in that process with Nist, what a good product might look like, and when we would be looking for that to be accomplished? What kind of time frame is that going to take?
Sure. So I think, just in terms of background, the Congressman Foster's bill focuses a lot on Nist, I think, as a way to try and address a lot of the concerns we've heard about today. In terms of whether it's the public sector or the private sector developing some of these systems, how do you come up with standards and best practices that can actually set a high bar for privacy, for security, for inclusion? I think there's a lot of concerns that people might have about different industry solutions or even a government solution running amok and losing sight of the importance of the high bar in all of those areas can be accomplished with standards. And so I think, look, one of the great things Nist does, and this background for the committee I covered in my written testimony, I used to lead the Trusted Identities Group at Nist several years ago. Nist is a great way to engage with stakeholders, not just nationally, but globally from across the public and private sector. And so I think a benefit of having Nist lead this is that they can frankly bring in, whether it's technical experts like David and Louise, or academics like Elizabeth, or entrepreneurs like Victor, to all come and provide different inputs and then weigh them and synthesize them in a way that, get some outcomes that I think might address all of those issues. I think the what, it's not just technical standards, but it's also the business practices. How do you collect data? What recourse do people have? If something goes wrong, how do you protect it? Really, what do I need to know beyond just following a technical standard? And the win, Nist has tackled this for the cybersecurity framework, the privacy framework in 12 months. It's an elevated or escalated time frame. My former Nist colleagues will probably be frowning at me if they're watching this now because it's a lot of work to get done in a year.
Right.
But this is a national crisis. We can get it done.
And Professor Renieris, you mentioned identity as a socio-technical construction, which I think that's a great way to frame it. From your perspective, what would you want to be seeing from Nist's product that would give you confidence that we are architecting government identity proofing in a way that is not going to lend itself to abuse? And also, to my colleague, Mr. Taylor's point, is not going to lend itself to an inappropriate amount of government concentrated power.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. So it's an interesting question with regard to Nist. So Nist, of course, is focused on technical standards. I would say the advantage of having Nist lead on this front is that they're not subject to some of the perverse incentives I was talking about earlier, and that they have a very long and comprehensive track record of designing standards in a way with the right incentives and considerations in mind. That said, I think that it is important within Nist, of course, that that other experts are consulted, that there are these different types of expertise that I mentioned that go beyond the sort of narrow mathematical, technical, and engineering conception of these things, which Nist has done before, and in their identity guidance have also been very mindful of some of those considerations. Now, proofing is considered a relatively technical exercise, but I think to Mr. Grant's point, I think the reason it's so important is because it is really the gateway to all of this. It's the sort of critical first step. And what's really nice about that is if we rely on authoritative government issued identities, those are already accounting for some of those things that I was talking about, and they're not being designed by computer scientists exclusively, and so they're rooted to real world socio-technical concepts as it is. So there's sort of a good foundation there. And again, this is something I go into a bit more detail.
Professor, I'm going to jump in with the last 15 seconds for Mr. Grant, just because it's a subject of conversation increasingly. Two-factor authentication as a way to do identity authentication, basically two orthogonal means of identifying yourself with a password and then your text message or a Google app, whatever. Is that still the best standard for identity authentication?
For authentication, yeah, I think, look, there's no such thing as a secure password these days. And in fact, my old colleagues at Nist have told you the guidance of uppercase and lowercase and symbols and numbers. Even a 64-character password can get phished. I think the big challenge these days is even some two-factor the attackers have caught up with. They can phish the SMS codes. They can trick you into handing over the one-time passcodes. I use a FIDO security key, which is a hardware key that can't be phished. I think that's where things need to move to, is authentication using things like the FIDO standards based on public key cryptography.
And I'm out of time, so Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. And I guess we have member interest in another round of questions, so I will begin by recognizing myself for another 5 minutes. If we do proceed to, as part of the infrastructure package, federally subsidize the deployment of mobile IDs in the different states, it gives us an opportunity to set minimum standards for privacy and other important aspects. So what are the red lines for privacy that we should really keep our eye on and insist have to be present? Ones that get mentioned frequently, for example, are no silent interrogation of your app, that the user should be aware every time the ID is presented. Another one that that's been encountered is at a traffic stop, when you're asked to present your digital ID, you do not have to turn over your physical cell phone, that you simply have some form of electronic communication, so the law enforcement officer doesn't get to paw around your cell phone and see what else might be there. And so are there other, is there a good list somewhere, and what should be at the top of that list for insisting on from the privacy point of view?
So I think there are very good lists, and in my written testimony, I pulled together a number of them that I think can be used and represent a sort of diverse cross-section of what's been looked at so far in privacy. I would add to the list that you included, Chairman Foster, I would add that one of the most difficult things to try to protect against is a surveillance or tracking or aggregating data and then sifting through that data to find usage patterns. So I think the ability to use pairwise identifiers, individual identifiers for each transaction, tokens instead of uniform identifiers, and then being able, like enforcing not having central repositories to report usage. I think that's one of the tougher problems, but absolutely key to enforcing privacy for people who are going to use their digital identity and their trust in that.
Yeah. Do other witnesses have something to add on that?
Well, I just flag, I think what's important really is to have a process that looks at privacy risk holistically. And one of the things when I was at Nist that we launched out of the NSTIC program at the time was the Privacy Engineering Initiative at Nist, which was focused on how do you look at sort of a soup to nuts approach of privacy from different contexts and identify risks in any system and then come up with technical or policy mitigations to architect around them. That led to the NIST privacy framework. That was something actually that the previous administration had asked NIST to do. I think, one reason I'm excited that your legislation would have NIST focus here is it's the one place, frankly, in government or industry that I've seen that has a comprehensive framework that's specifically geared toward identity and security systems. Beyond that, I think the ability to granularly release certain data about yourself without others. When I look at how many copies of my driver's license might be online, especially over the last year, it's not really important for a lot of those entities to know everything about me. They might just need to know that I'm over 21 if I was, ordering whiskey during the pandemic, which I might have done once or twice, or, that I'm, eligible for something else. I think being able to focus just on sharing specific things about myself without all of my data, that's going to be quite important.
If I could also jump in, Congressman, I think one of the important things to recognize is we need to go upstream. By the time the data is collected or captured, it's often too late to have effective privacy protections in place. So we really do need to think about data minimization and other techniques. Certainly, privacy enhancing technologies play an important role here, but a concern there, of course, is that they often are very complex, which can result in a lot of user error. So we also have to think about things like design. We're really moving away from the graphical user interface. We've got other types of interfaces that we're moving into in the future. And so we're not going to be able to present long and cumbersome privacy notices and expect people to be able to ingest them and really understand what's happening. And so design is growing more critically in importance there, particularly the faster and sleeker these credentials can be used, and the quicker the interaction is, the more important that the design sort of on the back end, the front end, and also in terms of the privacy standards and engineering is really front and center before we talk about what we do with the data.
Thank you. And one of the killer apps for this, as it were, is central bank digital currencies, which the Financial Services Committee is very involved in, and that immediately gets into international usage because digital dollars should be useful for people around the world, and we're going to have to authenticate participants. And so, what is the status of international interoperability of these various ID initiatives?
Well, I'd say at least from a regulatory perspective in the banking world, it was about 1.5 years ago, the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, which is the body of global financial regulators that work together, put out digital identity guidelines. But I'd say it's much more of a cookbook in terms of how each country should look to design digital identity systems for some of these types of applications, including potentially CBDCs. In terms of true interoperability, I think a lot of it's going to have to focus on different countries, including the US, developing digital identity infrastructure, and then finding ways, whether it's through treaty negotiations or other mechanisms, to mutually recognize them. And I don't think we're there yet.
Well, thank you. And we'll now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Gonzalez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to probably just stay on one track around KYC AML, and this is for Mr. Grant. So it's widely reported that the basics of traditional identity information that the government requires banks to use for KYC AML, so name, address, social security number, et cetera, are widely for sale on the dark web. I too may have purchased some things online to get me through the pandemic, and you just never quite know where all that information ends up, but it doesn't give you the best feeling, frankly, when you turn on the news and every day there's a different cyber attack. Sophisticated banks and fintechs are using AI-based tools to verify information using multiple massive data sets instead of government-required info. Can you speak just from a cybercrime standpoint what the move to digital ID in the United States could get us?
Well, I think it makes it a lot harder for the attackers who are exploiting what in some cases is non-existent digital identity infrastructure or legacy tools that worked a few years ago, but that the attackers have caught up with. And so, so much of what I think about when it comes, not just with identity, but anything when it comes to cybercrime and cybersecurity, how do you prevent scalable attacks? How do you raise the cost of attack so that it's not easy for an attacker to do, frankly, what we have seen in banking or, government benefits over the last year, to slice through some of these systems. And so I think the more, whether it's looking at, some of the deterministic factors we can bring in with, what Congressman Foster's bill would do in terms of being able to ask an agency to vouch for you, just like, you can use your card in the paper world. How do you use it digitally? How do you augment that with AI as well to try and, I think I'd mentioned before, Congresswoman Adams had asked, how is AI used? Well, AI can study how criminal rings do things and look for, telltale signs. Putting those together, look, we're in a bit of an arms race against increasingly organized, criminal gangs. They're starting to use AI as well. And so I think, we're going to need, unfortunately, every, weapon at our disposal to guard against these increasingly sophisticated attacks.
Thank you. Mr. Fredung, same question to you. From a cybersecurity and protection standpoint, what does moving towards digital ID do for your average American?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. First of all, I would like to follow on what Jeremy mentioned there as well in regards to staying ahead of the more sophisticated fraudsters as well. From what we have seen in the space, like the easier fraudulent attacks by shaming information on the documents, this is pretty much easy for companies such as ourselves to prevent oneself against. The more sophisticated ones using, let's say, AI deepfakes, for example, that's the tougher one to essentially track down. Switching from what we usually refer to as data validation, I think you mentioned in regards to the social security number, or I think Elizabeth also mentioned in regards to the Otter code or checking part of the PII information from one individual against the database. That's quite outaged, to be completely honest, because anybody can steal anybody else's information, and just tapping into a government database don't give you a particularly accurate result. So by moving towards more of the identity verification, which combines a visual document verification alongside a biometric authentication, is definitely, out of our experience, the way to go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. I have no more questions.
Thank you, and we'll now recognize Mr. Caston for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I'm glad we have the second round because I ran out of time with Professor Renieris, so I want to follow on, and I want to pick up on some stuff that I think you alluded to this in your conversation with Mr. Budd and Mr. Auchincloss. There's huge advantages of blockchain and distributed ledger technology more broadly, as far as like creating obviously creating a record of this digital ID, where it is, and making sure that there's some integrity to the data that stores it. There's also, as we've seen in the crypto space, the potential for anonymity that comes from that can be abused. And so I guess I have a two-part question. Number one, are you satisfied that blockchain is the right technology to store the data around a digital ID? And let me just hear your answer to that before I go to the second question.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. So I addressed this in my written testimony and quite explicitly point out that I think blockchain is absolutely the wrong technology for personal identity management. So I have a lot of experience in this space. I've worked directly in-house with blockchain startups. I've worked with many in my own consultancy. I've advised various intergovernmental groups on this. Blockchain is inherently an accounting technology. Its features are transparency, auditability, traceability, and permanence or immutability. So those are things that you might want to use for example, supply chain management, but they're really not things that you want to use for personal identity management if you're concerned about the privacy and security of individuals. Over the last 4 to 5 years, as I've been part of these conversations with governments and industry, there have been many technical solutions proposed to get around some of the concerns. So a lot of different pseudonymization and anonymization techniques, a lot of different methods of encryption. But conceptually, at the heart of what blockchain does and what it's designed to do is really at odds with core data protection principles around things like data minimization. So for example, if I want to prove who I am, I don't want that data replicated across nodes around the world. If I do that, I don't want the data stored indefinitely. So there, really, to me, it's a complete misfit between the purpose you're trying to achieve. But I know you have more questions.
Well, that's helpful. So the reason why I tie this to my earlier question is because in my head, at least, this is tied to, is there going to be a privately owned for-profit digital ID that's going to get out ahead of us? Because the value of that data, there's the narrow part of my biometrics that this is me, I know this is you, and then there's all the metadata around it, which is of course where the money is, right? Who are you connected to? Where was the GPS tag when you used your ID? What did you use your ID for? Et cetera, et cetera. However we store this, and I'll stipulate that you've got an idea in your head about where we should store this digital ID. Should we also be using that same place as the repository for the metadata? Where should that metadata live? Because someone's going to use it. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's a really important point to make, and I think that sophisticated sort of blockchain teams working on this have recognized that it's really a bad idea to store the actual identity credentials on the ledger, and so they've come up with workarounds for that. But ultimately, the ledger, the blockchain, is a record of the metadata that you're describing, the transactional data. And I think a really important thing that's very overlooked in this conversation is that the commercial incentives I was talking about in the business models, the revenue models here, can really undo a lot of the technical features intended to provide privacy and anonymity. So, for example, a lot of the blockchain-enabled identity schemes really lack a business model, and a common one that's proposed is a kind of a scheme where the verifying party pays the issuer of the credential when that credential is used to kind of recoup some of the costs of issuing the credential. When you have that kind of scheme where you pay for verification, ultimately you have to be able to separate the accounting and the transactions. And that's actually a more sophisticated problem to solve than a lot of the companies I've seen in the space have thought about, if they've even thought about this question. And so again, even if you have the best sort of encryption technologies or anonymization techniques in place, you might have a business model that undoes all the benefits of the technology.
So I realize we're out of time, but and maybe there's a longer conversation, but you know, if I take my government issued passport right now, that's got a whole lot of metadata in it. It's got the date of issue, it's got where I've traveled, it's got all the information, and there's some value to governments of having that information, right? Or my birth certificate or anything else. If we do a perfect government digital ID, should we be collecting and accumulating that metadata? We get into privacy issues and all the rest of that, but somehow we have to solve that question, right? And I realize I'm out of time, but would welcome your thoughts.
I think the question is to what end and for what purposes, and I think those have to be explicitly stated up front. I think this is certainly something I also allude to in my written testimony. I'm happy to provide more feedback on the record.
Thank you. Yield back.
Understand how you could possibly implement a witness protection program using a blockchain-enabled ID, which is, you know, essentially government-sponsored identity fraud. We'll now recognize Mr. Taylor for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Casson, I think if you go back last year, Professor Renieris actually resigned from the ID 2020 project, objecting to blockchain. So you actually asked the exact right person on this panel about blockchain and identity. And it was a really fascinating conversation, Professor Caston. Would you like 60 seconds to kind of continue down this rabbit hole?
Oh, you're very kind. I'll defer to your time, but maybe we can just follow up. Maybe we can set up a time for the three of us if you'd like to get together offline when we're not watching the clock tick away. Then I appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah. Anyway, I appreciate your passion for this particular topic and the importance you feel of not using blockchain technology for identification. Just going back down kind of the horror story, and it's really instructive to me to know, what not to do, as it's also instructive of what to do. And Dr. Maynard-Atem, I know in your written testimony you talked about, I believe, the health system in Kenya, women's ability to access that because of the identification system they put in place. Do you want to expand with what you've seen in terms of how not to do it, how we shouldn't do a digital identification system?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think in my written testimony, I do share a little bit of the horror stories or the ways that it has gone wrong, and a lot of that comes from, and I think Professor Renieris mentioned this previously, of not taking into account who your actual users are and not taking into account what it is that they are trying to achieve with digital identities and any solutions that are put in place. So in the instance in Kenya, as I referenced, lots of people in that particular market, women don't tend to have access to the required documents or mobile phones, etc., to allow them to make their way through the process of obtaining a digital identity. If I think about examples here in the UK, a lot of the digital identities previously and the schemes that have been tried have been reliant on having certain documents or access to the internet, for example. And I think it's 20%, but don't quote me on that, of the UK that don't have those government issued documents. So if your predication of digital identity is based off of having access to particular things, whether that's documents or whether that's, a mobile phone, etc., then automatically you are excluding X percentage of your entire population that you're designed to serve. So I think the requirements gathering at the start of all of these exercises needs to take into account the different situations that people are in, and you need to be able to account for those different situations. So yes, all of us on this call clearly have access to technology and government issued IDs, but we need to be thinking about the people that don't have access to those things, or that may not be able to access those things. Those people who can't necessarily use technology to get to the systems that they need to get to the services that they need. So I think it all starts at the very beginning of the process in being able to identify all of the different use cases that you're trying to serve, rather than just the most common use cases that you could satisfy the majority of people. We need to take into account all of those differences and make sure we're accounting for those in the solutions that we produce.
Professor Renieris, just going back to you, and you touched briefly on India in my prior question. Could you just talk a little bit about how, in your mind, India went wrong? I think that's, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I recall that phrase by you. So.
Sure. I think the situation with Aadhaar in India is, I mean, there are a couple of places where they went wrong. Firstly, they intended this single unique identifier and the system to apply to every aspect of life. So there's literally nothing you can access without using it. And it's entirely traceable across all these facets of life by the government. The Constitutional Court has subsequently looked into this and specifically said that it was, an overreach, and that there are concerns about dialing some of that back. But in terms of the questions around inclusion and that was also a big concern there, where because of the complexity of India and because of the complexity of the population, everything from different languages to different cultures to very different infrastructure in different regions in the country, there wasn't enough consideration around how groups might be impacted in that respect and how they might be excluded. And I think we have a very similar problem here. We talked about broadband earlier in the hearing, where we don't have a homogenous population. We don't have universal access to things. And so if we sort of, as Dr. Maynard-Atem said, if we only solve for the majority, then it's sort of the tyranny of the majority there, and we don't have the pluralism and the pluralistic perspective we need to design a system that is actually inclusive and will work for most people.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Professor. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And we'll recognize Representative Adams for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Cyber attacks are the fastest growing crime in the U.S. and one of the largest threats to the data and electronic infrastructure today. Industry studies have predicted a business will fall victim to ransomware every 11 seconds this year. A centralized digital ID base of people's personal information would be a huge target. So, Mr. Kelts, can you discuss the cryptography and the smartphone techniques available so that there would be no need for a centralized digital ID database?
Yes, I think that there's multiple different architectures that can support what you're referring to and not having a centralized database. There is, in the mobile driver's license, there's opportunities to take that data and put it onto the smartphone itself, along with the cryptographic signatures. So then when that data is shared, selectively shared, the signatures can be shared with it, and the verifier can take the signatures and check on that data. I think there are other architectures as well, similar to that, and I actually think that something like a distributed ledger or blockchain that holds hashes has that capability. If I have the data and I present to you as a business or verifier the data, you can then go and check the veracity of that data. In addition, I think, in addition to not centralized databases, having access to verifiable data, cryptographically verifiable data, can reduce the need for businesses themselves to store the end result, because they know the next time that person comes along that they will get fresher, newer, validated data, and they don't have to keep large records. I think that there's the potential also to reduce not just centralized databases, but peripheral databases that are also the targets of the hacks.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have no further questions. I'll yield back.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days with which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. So I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able to those. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials for the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to email addresses provided to your offices. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.